I'd now like to introduce Rebecca Wells. Rebecca is well known for her work on BBC Radio 4 on the food programme, but she's now at City University doing a PhD, and I'm sure she'll herself tell you more about that in her contribution. And she's going to talk about reporting food risk and, what is the role of the journalist.
Hello everybody, thank you very much for coming and for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk about my work, both as a journalist and latterly as an academic. What I wanted to do today, just a brief outline, is to talk about my background as a journalist and my research that I'm doing at the moment, which is focused on red and processed meat and cancer, which we've heard about a little bit earlier today. I want to talk about media as a contested arena. I'll explain that a bit later. Talk about reporting in context. I know that people have said it already. Context is very important in these circumstances. Influences on the media and some conclusions. And I think we'll have some questions later on in this session. So for my background, I'm a former radio producer. As has already been mentioned, for a long time. I worked mainly on the national speech network Radio 4, which does news and features. I'm working on a programme for a long time called the Food Programme, which is a half-an-hour weekly programme that looks at all aspects of food history, recipes, cooking, GM, nutrition, you name it, we covered it. And I was employed for a long time at the BBC. In academic terms, I'm what's called a reflexive practitioner, so I have personal practical experience in food journalism, and that inevitably influences my research. And all those awful headlines or great headlines, you can blame me for those as well as a journalist. So my PhD that I took up in October 2011 at City University is jointly held between the Centre for Food Policy and the Department of Journalism. So I'm looking particularly at the intersection of food policy and the media, so how those two things interact. And that means I spend a lot of time thinking about how the media might affect food policy and specifically nutrition policy, and specifically looking at diet's role in the prevention of cancer. So my PhD research stemmed really from concern about media reporting. We've seen some of those concerns today. All of these headlines are from a national UK tabloid called The Sun. And these sorts of headlines about cancer, some of them are contradictory, some of them are just very specific kind of magic bullet type things, why pumpkins could help beat cancer. And these sorts of headlines are not unusual in the UK, and there seems to be a particular fascination with things that cause or don't cause cancer, maybe for obvious reasons. Today I'm going to talk a bit more about reporting of risk more specifically, and this is a quote from David Miller and Jackie Riley's work back in the 1990s. They looked extensively at food scares in the UK in the late 80s and early 90s, such as BSE and salmonella. And they noticed, as others have done, that the media is not a mirror in the sense of that the amount of coverage of an issue doesn't reflect the amount of disease that it causes. So they were looking at BSE and CJD, and they noticed that this issue got a lot more coverage than, for example, more widespread issues such as coronary heart disease. So they said media coverage of health issues or public concern about those issues does not mirror the incidence of disease or the severity of the health problem calculated in terms of human misery or death. And here's a graph on the same sort of issue that shows that more clearly, perhaps. By their own description, this is from Roger Harrabin and his colleagues who did this study for the King's Fund. It's a crude illustration, but it illustrates the previous point quite well. And you can see that smoking has a huge number of deaths per story, whereas something like VCJD has a very small number of deaths per story. It's worth noting this is quite an old paper now, so this is going back to 2003. And I'd be interested to see how the numbers have changed. I think obesity might have a lower bar now and CJD a higher one. So this is Miller and Riley going back to them, talking about this issue of deaths per story and asking why does it happen. And they say, while widely recognised, the reasons for this remain poorly explained. For some commentators, this relates to inadequacies in human perception, sometimes allied with irresponsible or sensational reporting by the mass media. Such explanations oversimplify and misrepresent the complex social processes that combine in the production of news media accounts and public perceptions of social problems. So it's complicated, and that's why I'm interested in looking at the framing of the issues and the forces at work behind the reporting. For example, the different actors that are involved in these reporting and the pressures on journalists. And you might say, well, I'm a former journalist, I would say that, wouldn't I? And you'd probably be right. But I'm not claiming that the mass media don't sensationalise things and they don't sometimes get things wrong or inaccurate reporting. It's just, I think it's more complicated than that, or it can be more complicated than that, and I'm interested in sort of underlying forces behind what's going on. So the focus of my research is getting narrower, and I'm told by my supervisor that's normal. I'm focusing in on coverage on red and processed meat and cancer in red and processed meat, which we've also heard a little bit about earlier today. I noticed that there was a lot of coverage of research into this, and it seems to be a particular fascination for the press in the UK anyway. I'm not sure about more widely in Europe. And this may be to do with our particular fondness for beef and bacon, but there seems to be other things going on there. So I wanted to give you a few examples of some of the reporting that I've come across. These are all from British newspapers. So this one, a person's chance of suffering from certain types of bowel disease rises by between a quarter and a third if they eat more than 4 ounces or 120 grams a day of red or processed meat, the study found. For processed meat alone, every ounce consumed each day can raise the risk by 10%. Now already we're coming to the whole idea of absolute and relative risk that Edward talked about. And I think this is really quite hard to make sense of, the statistics and the figures. And it's very hard as a journalist when you're faced with a lot of statistics and figures from a report to make sense of that and to be able to make sense of that for a lay person who's reading it. And that can be very difficult. Percentages, fractions, ounces and grams, it can be quite hard. This was an article in the Daily Mail, another British newspaper, which looked at different foods to eat at different stages in your life. Headlined, "Are you too old to eat sausages?" It went through the decades, and this is when it got to the 60s and over, recommended avoiding eating sausages. And so 80% of bowel cancers arise in the over 60s, so cut back on processed meat. So are they saying it's okay to eat processed meat if you're 59 and under? Or, in your 60s you should just stop then? So that can be confusing. This one is particularly interesting. It's written by a celebrity columnist. I don't know if you know him. His name is Jeremy Clarkson. He's presents a programme about driving and automobiles. He's got a reputation for speaking his mind and plain speaking. So I'll just read the first little bit of it. "We're told we can get all the iron and zinc we need if we eat leaves and grass, and lettuce works actively to keep the big C at bay. Yes, but lettuce is just frilly green tap water and I hate it. It's the most pointless foodstuff known to man, and frankly you may as well chew the air." So he's kind of obviously being his usual bombastic self. And I think this is partly media as entertainment, and that is one of the roles of the media, and it's almost him giving us what we want to hear, perhaps, giving us an excuse to eat the sausages that we want to eat. And trying to make us laugh in a kind of very typically bombastic style. But for the people that did the research that goes behind that, I'm not sure that they would be so happy about that. And then you get this kind of backlash effect, or you can get a backlash effect. Having read the previous day about red meat being bad for you, now giving up can also be bad for you. So as a consumer, you get these confusing messages like we heard about earlier. Coffee, one day you're supposed to drink coffee, the next not, and all of these kind of things. And this same article acknowledged some of the inconsistencies of the reporting and some of the problems that had come up and the different stories that had come up day after day or week after week, and acknowledging that different studies have come up, particularly about red meat. And this quote, that one that just came up, was from a story which covered recommendations on red and processed meat consumption from the UK Department of Health from 2011. And these recommendations still stand, and this is from the UK's NHS National Health Service Choices website, talking about meat as a good source of protein, vitamins and minerals in your diet. However, Department of Health advise people who eat them more than 90 grams a day of red and processed meat should cut down to 70 grams. So these current recommendations are based on a report from the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition from 2010, which say that the consumption of red and processed meat is probably associated with an increased risk of colorectal cancer, but the evidence doesn't allow quantification of the amount of red and processed meat that might be linked. So basically, in other words, it's not possible to say how much you can eat without increasing your colorectal cancer risk. So there's some uncertainty here about this message and about this recommendation, but the Department of Health and the government have seen fit to make a recommendation based on the national average intake. And I think uncertainty in science, this has been formulated as trans-scientific questions by Weinberg in 1972. These are questions that can be asked of science but can't be answered. And Buffton, Smith and Berridge, in their work on nutritional policy making in the UK, have looked at this and have said that interpretations of ambiguous data are often conditioned by broader quasi-political interests. So basically, when there's no scientific consensus, opportunities arise for interested parties to come in and make claims and counterclaims and contest policy and information in accordance with their own beliefs and politics. And so, going back to this Daily Mail report and thinking about this contested arena, how can we explain this information and this idea that you get these different information coming up in the media? And how can readers make sense of these messages and these different messages, conflicting messages that seem to be confusing? And one way that you can think about it, and from my experience as a journalist, if you think about it from the journalist point of view, I know that the media is very much a contested arena. In other words, different parties are keen to get their message across. And so that there is pressure from different parties to get their message on the television or the radio or on social media for that matter. And this contested ground has been explained by academic models such as this one from Tim Lang, which sees tensions between three main groups in the contested space of nutrition. So you've got the state, the food supply chain and civil society. And going back to this issue of red and processed meat and thinking about the different players, and unravelling the different players within that triangle. The reporting context of this story, it goes way back to 1998. There was the predecessor of the Scientific Advisory Committee, COMA, brought out a report right in the aftermath of BSE. And so this whole story about red meat came up after this BSE scandal and beef scandal. There was a new Labour government. And when the COMA report was published, the meat industry had already in previous years been put under pressure to reduce the fat profile of their products. And the media had already sort of had these templates that they developed for food scare stories from Salmonella and BSE. There was also this sort of political muscle flexing start of a new government. Jack Cunningham, who was the minister at MAF, the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food, and the minister at the Department of Health. There was a reported disagreement of them. And one of the concerns raised about the recommendations to eat less red and processed meat was the issue of iron. So this led to the setting up of another committee, and Sacken reported on iron and health to try and iron out those problems. And these two conflicting messages, on the one hand that there may be the risk of cancer from eating too much red and processed meat, on the other hand the health benefits of eating red meat, specifically the iron intake and the iron status of the population. And all the while the butcher's meat industry is in sort of ongoing crisis with BSE, foot and mouth, and the pig industry shrinking. And so the influential actors that come out of these context and that journalists are trying to communicate complex information from are having to deal with lots of different actors and gatekeepers of this information. And the journalists themselves are also important gatekeepers. They have their own personal and organisational pressures or the whims of their editors, competition from other stories of the day, their own personal interests in education. And some of the influential actors in this, the development of this story have been listed up here: scientific advisory committees, NGOs, non-governmental organisations, so charities, cancer research organisations, government policy makers, politicians, and industry bodies. And in the same sense, you've also got the media organisations also living or dying by their audience. So even those that are not commercial are beholden to their audience in some respects, or have to listen to what their audience are telling them in some respects. And I think that's an important consideration for any journalist. The mass media, as we've talked about earlier, is widely perceived to be under threat from new media and social media, bloggers, etc., and declining figures, especially in newspapers, or certainly hard copies of newspapers. And there's a lot of concern about the effect this is having on the quality of journalism and the ability of journalists to report accurately, given the time that they've got to write the stories, and also to navigate the pressures from the actors that I've just mentioned. So, in conclusion, the media have been criticised for inaccurate or misleading reporting, but they're also operating in a highly contested arena and are reporting on and within complex social processes with lots of pressures from external actors such as industry, NGOs, politicians or scientists. And they're having to navigate these pressures. And the pressure from these external actors can increase when risk messages are uncertain or controversial. And there is concern that increased economic pressures on the mass media will have a negative effect on journalists' ability to navigate this terrain. So I think we're going to have some questions a bit later on after the debate, but thank you very much, and that's me.